All right, thank you for the introduction and thank you all for being here. I am going to share my screen. I have a little slideshow. So let me get that switched over. Okay, so I think you should see my slideshow now. If you don't, holler at me. Um, so as Nancy mentioned, I am going to be talking to you about trying to do the ever-challenging task of making space for research. I do want to start with a little bit about me. So um, I am currently in a tenure track position. I was a lecturer with a heavy teaching load for, gosh, I don't remember, 8 or 9 years before moving to the tenure track position. So it's a very real sort of struggle for me to figure out how do we research under those circumstances. Currently, I teach a 3-3, but that is with a course reassignment for research. So, kind of at any time, they can decide we need you back on a 4-4. So the struggle is real. Um, when I left the lecturer position, it took a lot of energy and focus to rethink a teaching position to more a research focused one where my evaluation research is weighted more heavily, where it wasn't counted at all before. I kind of did research for fun on the side in a sense. So this is quite different. Um, and so, I mean, I'm going to be talking about that process and experience and what some best practices are throughout the course of today. So first, I'm just going to do a quick little informal poll. I'm not going to do a full poll, on Zoom. It's really just to kind of start some conversation. But if you wouldn't mind typing into the chat what you sense to be a number one friction point for you at this point in time. I'd love to get your thoughts. And it could be all of these. Like looking at this, I'm like, oh, well, kind of depends on the day of the week, right? Depends on which one it might be. Service creep, B, that leads to C. B and D, yep. C and D, okay. I'm not seeing any A's so far, which I find to be interesting. Okay, there's an A. I spoke too soon. All right. So I asked this because one, it's useful to identify what are those places of friction and what are those challenges so that we can then think in targeted ways about how do we work to try to mitigate those to the best of our ability. So over the course of this workshop, we're going to be talking about how do we maintain the integrity of our work. For me, that was a huge concern. How do I spend more time on research? It feels like I'm abandoning my students. I wasn't abandoning them, but it kind of felt in that way. I'm putting less time and energy into my students. What's sort of the fallout or consequence of that going to be? And that can be, kind of hard and challenging to think about. So over the course of this workshop, I'm going to start by talking about grading workflows and ways that we can streamline and think about that. Then I'm going to talk about modular lesson plans, really using templates. And then we'll talk about how do we create sort of these micro research plans to, seal those 15 minutes, 30-minute gaps that we can generally more easily find in our schedule than like a whole research day. So that is our structure for today. So I want to start again with talking about that research component here. So rubrics are really helpful. If you don't currently use a rubric for grading, I recommend that you do use one. And instead of using points-based rubrics, where sometimes we agonize over, is this 85 points or is it 87 points or 89 points or 91 points, right? What is the difference? It can be useful to use an evaluative rubric that is focused more, and this is just one example, excellent, meets expectations, revisable, or there's no evidence of meeting expectations. You can use different language, that suits you and your purpose, but that helps to sort of give you these 4 buckets to categorize things into. We can also batch grade by criterion in our rubrics. So if there is a research component of our rubric, we can grade all of the submissions looking for that research piece. How are they ranking on research? And then we can create feedback banks. Where there, sometimes, I'd say often when we're grading, we notice that there are gaps in similar areas across submissions. So if research is an area of struggle, we can create a comment that talks in specific ways about what the issue is and how do we improve. And we can, sort of copy and paste that with some edits, copy and paste that for each submission. So all of these methods are useful because they help us to think about comparing like with like. So we're focused on one aspect at a time. Because when we're looking at a whole essay, we're looking at all the different pieces at once. But if we compare like with like, multiple submissions, what is that criteria? It helps us to stay more attuned and to have more consistent grading across that area. Sometimes we get tired when we're grading, so we might not consciously, but subconsciously start being more flexible, or we had a frustrating phone call, maybe more critical, right? Those are times we need to step back, but this helps to mitigate some of that. So a little bit more detail here in talking specifically about Gen AI. So Gen AI, I'll mention it kind of throughout here. It certainly is not a requirement for anybody to use, but I have found it to be a really useful tool to help with streamlining some of those grading processes and decisions. One area I found it to be really helpful is with rubrics. So I create the assignment sheet, and then I feed the assignment sheet to Gen AI, and I ask it to create a rubric for me. And it creates clear criteria. It helps me to be faster in my grading and provide more consistent feedback. And the rubric, the rubric that it spits out, I can make revisions to it, certainly to be more in line with what I am hoping for it to be, but it gives me a good starting place, which can be really important. So if you haven't had instruction on prompt engineering in the past, I do just want to briefly mention some prompt engineering tips. You can just Google prompt engineering. You'll get all kinds of things if you do that. But generally, it is best when you can be really detailed and specific with Gen AI and give it directives. So who is it pretending to be? Who is it writing as? What do you want it to do? Why is it doing this task? And where does this task fit in a larger context? And what are perhaps some limitations of that? So I am going to switch over. I think you should see that I have switched over to ChatGPT here. Awesome. Just to give you one example of what this can look like, I did pre-submit these questions so that we wouldn't get too slowed down by typing it in and waiting for it to think. Let me see if I can zoom in a little bit in case it's a little small for folks. So I teach English at Purdue Northwest in Northwest Indiana. So my examples are admittedly English related. So I said, you are an English professor working on creating a rubric for a rhetorical analysis essay. Create a rubric that follows the EMRN model versus being points-based. The rubric should address content, use of evidence, outside sources, grammar, mechanics, formatting. This will be used to assess and give feedback to the students. So, you've given it this context, you've given it a really specific task. And then this is an example of what it could spit out. So rhetorical analysis and content. The focus is on understanding rhetorical situation, claims, and strategies. So you can see it, again, it gives some really specific and concrete items for me to look for in my assessment. I would then, once I was happy with it, I might go back and forth and ask for some revisions. But once I was happy with it, I could put that into my LMS, and then I could in my experience, I've used a couple different ones. Often it's like click boxes. You can click box your rubric as you are assessing, and that helps with your process. So I'm going to scroll down to the end here just to show optional overall feedback categories. So it gives you even a suggestion. You might include a short narrative section. If you'd like, I can do the following. So adapt this. So notice I didn't give it the grade level that we're working with. So I can adapt this for first year composition or for an upper division course. Create a student-facing version with plainer language. So it's giving you some suggestions and some ideas, some things that you may not have thought about before. Or turn it into a single page checklist for peer review. Now we have like sort of a lesson plan, right? And we've taken the rubric, converted it to a checklist. We have a class that they do a peer review or a self-evaluation or a workshop. So let me hop back over to my slides. Batching checklist. So batching is helpful because we can time box sessions. And again, when we're comparing like to like, it's useful when we are in that same frame of mind to be looking for those kinds of things. And if you, boxing your time, so using something akin to the Pomodoro technique, for instance, can be really useful because you have this finite amount of time, let's get what we can accomplished in that window. So we use that same idea when we are assessing. And in this case, the suggestion is to sort by criteria. So you can identify different status tags. So while you are assessing, you see that, oh, this one needs an example. And then you're prepared to speak to that. Or when I've taught online and if it's had like discussion boards where it's asked to respond, I see, oh, this person didn't respond. So I'm going to skip that one for now. I'm going to go to the ones who completed the whole task and proceed from there. Yes, Nancy.
Just identify status tags. That sounds technical or specific. What do you mean by that?
Yes. So I would describe it as, so this is kind of my own language, to be clear, but it is thinking about traits or markers, identifiers for where the submission is. So in the example, the example is needs an example, but so it's when you're looking at the assignment submission and you are noting it is missing this thing or it needs this thing. And then we grade and we sort of batch grade the ones that are consistent and have that issue or that struggle at the same time.
Okay.
Because then, again, we're kind of in that headspace of, let me give feedback to all the students who struggle with including examples in their work. And so we're not taxing our brain by switching gears. It's like, okay, now it's the next submission. They have a different need. And then 3 more later, now we're back to the one that needs an example. So it's trying to identify and mark the ones that have this issue and evaluating those at once.
Okay, so like time boxing sessions and sorting by criteria are a way to kind of organize how I set up my grading time. And then identifying status tags is maybe organizing how I give feedback. Like, oh, I know these need this particular feedback, so I'm going to grab that feedback for all of those that needs example or something like that, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
thanks.
So it's like organizing the submissions. Yeah, yeah. And then another strategy that you can use related to this is you can use those like status tags as identifiers. And then you can sort of give batch feedback. So you can either give a whole class feedback or just to those students who have those sorts of challenges and, send out an announcement, for instance, that speaks to everybody. And I would say often everybody can benefit from that refresher, right? If a chunk of the class is struggling with examples, you give that refresher to everybody, everybody can benefit from having a refresher on that knowledge. And that helps to reduce the labor of everybody gets an individual comment. And that is where the feedback bank also comes in. So the feedback bank is really like a curated collection of high quality comments. So if you're finding that consistently students need to include examples in their work, we write one comment that talks in really concrete ways about how they can improve and how they can revise if we're thinking about a writing assignment or redo it. That is action oriented so that they can then take that and do something with it. So again, if we're focused on the individual submissions, we might get tired of saying the same thing over time and kind of subconsciously we start to summarize or be more brief, be less detailed. But if we have a comment that we can go to, like I've explained this really well here, let me save that one. Then we can just copy and paste, make a few edits so it might be applicable to the student specifically. Where you might say in paragraph 3, where you brought this up. That's a good place to give an example. Feedback banks are really helpful when they're organized by rubric or assignment type because, the outcomes of assignments are, even if they're overlapping, they are going to be unique. And it provides that consistent messaging to all of your students. This is also a place where AI can help you because it can help to polish that language and try to get it as clear and concrete and action-oriented as possible. So just another place that you can leverage it to help, ask it to help you revise that comment to be as targeted as possible. All right, so we're doing good on time so far. So I would like it if you all take a few moments to think about, do this little activity, pick one current assignment and think about which of these things would be useful for you to try out. We'll take about 5 minutes so you can perhaps get started with it a little bit now. It's 2:49, so we'll say 2:55. But do you think you would work on revising a rubric, think about batching, or feedback bank comments? And if you could share in the chat once you have some ideas. All right, we have some great points coming up here in the chat. One thing to definitely be careful of is when you do the batch feedback, some language will require some edit, so that is a really great point. I've also found that when I give more whole class feedback, I kind of couch that statement in like, remember, office hours is a place that we can explore this more. And I have more students come to office hours when I'm like acknowledging this thing in front of the whole class and reminding them my office hours are at this time. If that doesn't work for you, I'm generally here, during these hours. And more students show up. The batching and status tags can be really challenging with an LMS. That is part of the challenge of it, and that there's not like a way to like tag submissions for yourself and then only look at ones that have certain needs at a given time. So the way that I do that is I just quickly scan it and then I just click to the next one if I see that's not what I'm working on right now, which is not the most efficient of tasks. So it's more like a mental, I would say, a mental tag than a literal tag. And then someone mentioned a graduate course. So certainly different courses, and that's something to keep in mind with all of these, right? It's not going to work for every single assignment, every single course. So you have to think about what are the needs of the student and where can we still support students and also acknowledge our own time constraints and time commitments. I haven't myself done video feedback, but I've heard other faculty members say that they find that to be helpful. And I know some faculty members, again, in English who teach writing, they do grading conferences, basically. So the student has to come to their office and they will grade the paper with a student sitting right there. So it forces the faculty member to confine the grading of the paper to 10 minutes, for instance. They can't spend 30 minutes giving feedback, responding on everything. It's just what can we accomplish in this time together. And that feedback with that conference with the student allows for them to ask questions in the process. So these are all really great points and observations. Thank you everyone for participating in the chat. So if you had to think about where you are right now and the classes that you are teaching, which of these do you think would save you the most time right now? Okay, so we're seeing a variety coming in, but again, it is going to change depending on your context in your class. And yeah, improving the rubrics each year is really helpful. Yes. And later we will talk about accountability. And that could be a part of, accountability. It's not necessarily a research task, but accountability with your grading is useful as well. Awesome. Okay, so I am asking these questions because sometimes I think as faculty members, we go to these workshops, we go to these sessions, and we're like, yes, this sounds great in the moment. And then we leave, and sometimes we forget to actually put it into action because we get bogged down and we get busy and we're on to the next thing as soon as this ends. Like for me, I have to get ready to go teach class, right? So, by taking these moments to pause, my hope is that we're starting to think about this and integrate it a little bit more instead of just rushing on to the next. So similar to how we work with feedback and can think about uses of Gen AI, we can apply this to our lesson plans. So when we are planning out class sessions and class activities, we can give and utilize Gen AI and have these sorts of template structures to help us in thinking about how a class session is going to go. Certainly, it's not a one size fits all. Certain classes, certain student populations, it is going to change. But a good sort of model is this one that we have here. We start with our goal, then we have a short engagement activity, then we have the core unit of the class, the core lesson, and then they apply it in some activity, and then they have an exit ticket to check assessment. So if we figure out what is the formula that will work for, I'd say 75% or more of our classes, this can help to streamline the course prep. So it's not every class we're starting from scratch. We already know we're going to follow this structure. Let's plug in the content for that unit. So to prompt Gen AI, let me switch back to my other example, demo 2. So here in the slides, I have a template language that you are welcome to use. But here I say you are an instructional designer. So I've given it the task to think of themselves as an instructional designer, create a 50-minute lesson plan using this shell. And then I copy and paste that course information, learning outcomes for that class session. And then I tell them to do an engagement activity. There's going to be a core lesson. They need an application and then an exit ticket. So, I've tried to lay it all out for Gen AI. What is it looking for? And it gives you a learning outcome in this instance, an engagement activity, evidence snap judgment, warm up students' instincts about what counts as strong evidence. And they give claims. It can break it down by minutes, the core of the lesson. So, me as the content expert, I know what I plan to say during the unit anyway. It's more just building or the class period anyway. It's more just building the activities around it that Gen AI can be really useful. I've also used it a lot to give me case studies or samples, like give me an example of a bad thesis statement, and then we talk about it in class. So this one, it gives you version A, version B. Let's talk about what's working and what's not working in these examples. Peer check session, uses a critique carousel. So they give you all these different options. This one gives a short slide outline. So in this sense, it is taking off some of that cognitive load where in general, like I know, right, this is how I would structure the class. But if my brain is a little tired that day, or if I'm trying to preserve energy for research, this is where I'm just like, okay, here we go. Slide 1, today's goal. And it can be a little bit easier to follow the directions rather than feel like you're coming up with it on your own. And then again, it'll end with some suggestions. Maybe we adapt this for a 75-minute class or an online class. What would be a quick rubric you could use in the classroom? So again, I just want to illustrate, what does this look like in practice? So this is, kind of the template that I could keep for every time I'm planning a lesson, and then I just copy and paste it and customize it to that class and to that session. I found that when I'm doing this, like I used to spend, I'd say probably an hour prepping for my class. Now it's like 20 minutes. Like it's actually, I was surprised when I started to do the math. I was like, wow, like I have 40 minutes still before class starts. What do I do? Um, so yeah, it's really useful. Relatedly, it's useful to have reusable activities. So again, we can think of these as templates. So again, depending on the courses that you're teaching, the student population you're working with, these might change, but some that are really useful is an error analysis task where they're looking at flawed work, they're trying to identify mistakes. The jigsaw method, where a student becomes an expert on one part of the topic and then they teach their peers that information. A case mini, so it's don't have time for like a case study in a single class session usually, but we can make a mini version of one. Critique carousel, where they rotate through peer work and they give feedback on a specific point and move around to the next one, almost like stations around the room to get feedback on different areas. And then you can do, in-class debates as well. So again, why these are useful is because we're reusing the shell. So we know that this is the approach, the method that we are going to use, and we are swapping the content. So that even holds true for our LMS assignment descriptions. If you know that you're going to have research logs over the course of the semester, we reuse that language of the research log and just swap out whatever that content piece is that changes from one to the next. We can also use it to create slide skeletons and slide templates that we can return to. And the idea is that we're building it once, so we're kind of doing the heavier cognitive load part one time, and then we're making smaller tweaks and changes throughout, similar to with the grading. We're doing the heavy cognitive load of creating that like feedback bank once, and then we're just making those minor tweaks for each iteration. All right, on to the research portion here. So in thinking about when we have a higher teaching load, ways to kind of get us into research and publishing and presenting is one, to have our research be related to our teaching. So we convert our existing assignments or interventions into scholarship on teaching and learning content. So it's whether it's a brief, it's a poster, it's a proposal, but we're repurposing what are we already doing and how can we see that fitting into maybe the call for papers that came in last week and that's kind of been sitting on your mind. It's also an opportunity to leverage existing data. So we do need to be mindful of IRB, which is also mentioned in the last point. But sometimes we can use the exit tickets or LMS analytics or rubrics. We can use those as a part of our subtle research where we don't need IRB if there's no identifying student data, involved in that work. Or maybe you tried a new assignment and you're writing a reflective piece on how that went. So there's ways that we can navigate that. And then we can have those micro studies. So, pre-post test, design narrative. We can do pilot studies on what we're doing in the classroom. Some of these will be exempt. Some might be, expedited for IRB. So those are going to be a little bit bigger of a task to take on than perhaps some of the others. So that is something to think about too as you're choosing projects, which are going to be IRB, which will be more involved in that sort of way, because even, doing interviews or surveys takes a different sort of cognitive load and time commitment than it would be to write about an assignment you did in the class on your own. So it's really useful to think about creating these micro plans with our research. A daily habit is really helpful, a daily habit to write in particular. And writing doesn't necessarily have to mean putting sentences on a page. Writing can sometimes be sitting and thinking and looking at the topic proposal, or sitting with your data set, or reading an article or looking for an article. You know that you need to find some research, so spend some time going through the library databases. It is hard to commit to. I acknowledge this. I struggle with committing to it. But even 15 minutes, you'll often surprise yourself what you can get done in that time frame. I personally find that I do it best when I start my day with my research micro habit. And I tell myself, all I have to do is 15 minutes of this task, and then I can move on to the next thing. And it helps with feeling like I'm neglecting my students, but it's like I do it first, 15 minutes, and then I can move on. It's also recommended to have 2 longer blocks of time per week. Again, this can be hard to do when we have high teaching loads. And it might, also depend on when do you work best. I am best in my morning. So that's when I try to put those protected blocks of time. From 9 to 10, I say I'm not available for meetings. 9 to 10 a.m. is when I am doing my research, and I'm doing these other, for me, they're higher labor, higher cognitive tasks, because I know that's when I'm at my freshest. And then it's also important to do that weekly review. So at the end of every week, what were your wins? What were your successes? What did you find your roadblocks to be? And then what is the next bite-sized chunk we can take for the following week? Again, you can use Gen AI to be your research support. So here I talk about it as your research productivity coach. So I say, you are my scholarly productivity coach. Create a 30-day plan for this project. Developing a conference presentation that I will later turn into an article for publication on my class assignment using Gen AI to teach editing professional writing. I give it some constraints, 15-minute micro task, 2 longer blocks, etc. And then it gave me some handy milestones. These are some very action-oriented things that I can do. I can come up with a focus claim by day 7. Like, that feels easy, right? I can come up with a claim in 7 days. And then as you work your way through, it's a breakdown of each day. What do you do? Give some suggested writing prompts to encourage, your writing and your productivity. Gives you different milestones. Week 4, we're in the polishing stage, and it gives you some guidance about what to do for that. And then it gives you a template for your weekly review. Here I have a checklist where if I'm a checklist person, I can print this out, keep it next to my computer, mark it off as I go. And so, again, it's like we know these things, are helpful, right? Especially if you know that you're a checklist motivated person. But the time that it would take for you to create a well thought out checklist can be a lot. And so we might skip it. But we just had Gen AI create it for us, right? Um, so often the idea is not that it's doing the work for us. We are offloading the tasks we already know we can do on our own, and we are choosing which ones are going to save us the most time and energy so we can put our cognitive load elsewhere. All right, the accountability section I mentioned earlier. So these are, I was thinking about them as research accountability, but they can be used for teaching accountability as well. Peer accountability pairs. So you do 2 to 5 minute weekly check-ins. I say pairs because in 2 to 5 minutes, you can't talk about a whole lot. So each person gets to talk for 2 to 3 minutes and you've done your check-in. That's a good way to do that weekly plan where what was my win? What was my block? What can I do next time? You can do this in triads or any size of a group. You just might need to shuffle how much time you devote to that. AI is accountability partner. You can do 30-day research sprints on your own. You can email yourself reminders, for future you, like by this date, you should have done this, right? Shows up in your inbox. You see it as the reminder. So part of it is tapping into what do you already know works for you? Do you need sort of body doubling where you go on Zoom with somebody and say, hey, can we just do a peer accountability group? We work on Zoom for an hour together on our research projects. Maybe we don't talk, we're just here. That works for me personally. I try to find people who will sit online and just be silent because it helps, right? So a big piece of it is seeing what works for you. Service boundaries can be really hard, and service creep really, all of it, right? There's always administrative tasks coming in. You need to submit your syllabus at the beginning of the semester. You need to submit, for us, midterm grades are coming up, to be due soon. So they're already sending us the emails about getting ready for midterm grades. If someone asks for your time, one thing you can do is you can defer it. You can say, I'm limiting new commitments this term. I'll be happy to revisit this at a later date and give them a specific time. You can again do that time boxing. I can only offer you a 60-minute window once per week. If the service commitment can't fit into that, then I'm sorry, I can't do it. Office hours for service, where you just batch service. For me, that's my Friday. My Friday is my catch-up day. Whatever slipped through the cracks, I'm doing it on Friday. And those calendar fences are really important, where you put those weekly holds on your time. So I urge you to do that as research, where it's like, nope, I am researching from this hour to this hour. And like, that's that. I'm not available outside of that time. It can be hard to remember, but it is important to remember that you're not saying no. You're protecting excellence. You are protecting your time so that you can be excellent in your work and do excellence in your work. Because if we are shorting ourselves in our other areas, and even like self-care, that is going to show up and affect the work that we do across the board. So it's critical that we maintain those boundaries. And I say this as someone who finds it hard to say no. So going back to this, the deferral is my favorite one because it is easier for me to say, I'm sorry, I can't take that. I have a lot going on. Like right now, I'd say I'm doing an event in March for the university. I can't take on anything else while we're finishing up planning for that event. But after spring break, mid-March, come back to me and we'll see what we can talk about then. Wrong way. There we go. We're running a little close on time. So, commitment form, this is just a good way to start your week. This is my Monday task first thing as soon as I sit down to work. I do some goal setting. This week I will. And I try to make it a research task, but sometimes if I'm feeling particularly overwhelmed, like my students turned in their papers yesterday on Sunday, I'm someone who does Sunday deadlines. So my goal this week will be grading. That's just, that's just the reality of it. Uh, my research micro habit this week is, and then adding that time to your calendar. I find it useful to personally, I kind of live and die by the calendar. Again, that's my personality trait. It's not everybody's, but I map onto the calendar from this hour to this hour, I'm doing this. And I just go down the calendar in these time blocks. Every hour, I'm doing something different to get it all done. All right. So the last thing I would like to ask for you all to do is just to take a minute to think about what is your next step. So thinking about this information here, what will you do next? And when will you do it? And then how will you reward yourself for completing it? So if you wouldn't mind sharing your thoughts in the chat. I love the chocolate or a nice latte. Yeah. Once a week, I usually get coffee going into work, and that's like my little treat for myself. Yes, that is such a good reward, more time with your family. Yes, I think, and that's something that can be hard to find in this when we can do our work whenever, right? How do we protect our time for our loved ones and for ourselves? Extra time for nap. I love naps. I love rewarding myself with naps. Oh, I feel that. Hmm. Stress-free Netflix binge. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So like all of these things, right? Like we need to find the things that keep us joyful, and find those moments that bring us that happiness. Read a book for fun. Yeah, I have a particularly busy week. So yesterday I did like nothing. I just sat and read like the whole day and it was glorious. All right, we'll keep pondering. Looks like we have another one that came in the chat. Uh, Finished last two episodes of Ted Lasso. Um, before you arrive on Wednesday within the next 48 hours. Awesome. All right, so that is really all that I have. So I'm happy for questions and conversation. I do want to remind you about Defend, Publish, Lead is also available as a support system and tool. And there's a podcast. The episodes are fairly short. And that can be a good thing, when you're walking from one class to the next or heading into work. Usually for me on my way home from work, I listen to music. I don't want to think, I don't want to think. Um, but there's a lot of different opportunities and support systems, out there. You just got to kind of find your people and find your spaces that work for you, right? So much of it is finding the trick of what is going to work for you and streamline your process. So thank you all so much for being here and participating.
Thanks, Brandy. Thanks for everybody who came out.